I would now like to welcome our first speaker in this session, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham. We welcome back Senator Birmingham, who is the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. He spoke at this conference both last year and the year before. He's been a Liberal Senator for South Australia since 2007 and is currently also the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. He served as Minister for Finance and before that, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment in the previous government. Welcome, Senator Birmingham.
Well, Zara, thank you so much for that welcome and your most comprehensive assessment of the state of international affairs. I feel after that introduction and that assessment that I got to hear most of, that I could almost skip the speech and we could proceed straight to the dialogue because you have covered so much of the field. To you, to Bryce and to Heather and all of the leadership team at the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Excellencies, dignitaries, special guests all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be back with you on a third occasion. An important day, Remembrance Day, a critical day in our nation as it is in so many around the world, as today we reflect 106 years ago upon the armistice and the conclusion of World War I. It's a time also, of course, to reflect on the reality that that end of World War I saw a period of great turmoil, of great disruption, and of further tragedy in World War II. And we mark this year 85 years since England and France, to be followed by Australia and other allies, declared war on Germany. 85 years ago, the world embarked after the silencing 106 years ago of the guns at the end of World War I. 85 years ago, the world embarked on another calamitous tragedy. But of course, that battle was equally, ultimately, fortunate and heroic. As freedom-loving people, we owe everything to that generation who carried the day in World War II against oppression and aggression of the time. Their victory after 2 world wars within 3 decades was followed by a determination to try to prevent that from happening again. It gave birth to what we now somewhat bureaucratically refer to as the global rules-based system. The United Nations Charter of 1945 has subsequently been complemented by a maze of well-intentioned agreements and organisations. But at its core, the ambition of this new system of global cooperation was a plan to avoid a future world war or another global conflict. In the words of the UN Charter, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. On one score, it had limited success. For decades, the Cold War raged, nuclear weapons proliferated, and real wars like those in Vietnam, Korea, or Afghanistan saw many more lives sacrificed. Yet a world war was avoided. Prosperity proliferated across open economies, and alongside the fall of communism, a burst of demilitarisation occurred, and new cooperative ways of keeping the peace were pursued in trouble spots, as exemplified by those deployments we saw at different times of blue beret-wearing peacekeepers. Then on September 11, 2001, terrorism burst the bubble of peaceful optimism that generations like mine and many of you in this room had embraced. The end of history was in fact something more insidious. Initially, the global rules-based system responded in ways that its founders perhaps envisaged, but the nature of another long war in Afghanistan and a more contested conflict in Iraq tested that resolve. While support for these conflicts waned and ideologically or religiously motivated terrorism expanded its network, new threats have grown. A variety of non-nuclear weapon states have pursued nuclear capabilities, with ill-intentioned regimes in North Korea and Iran showing scant regard or respect for efforts to contain their ambitions. Simultaneously, a new mark of leadership has emerged in superpowers old and new, namely Russia and China. Today we find a rising disregard for the peaceful ambitions and rules that followed the aftermath of World War II, and with that, growing global consequences. As you all know, Russia has brought bloody state-on-state, land-based territorial war back to European shores with its invasion of Ukraine. Firstly, by creeping acquisition, which, left unchecked and deliberately appeased, has only led to a further attempted full-scale invasion. Iran, as sponsors terrorists who are waging war or attacks from bases, including, of course, in Gaza, Lebanon and Yemen, prompting massive human suffering in a war with Israel and major threats to global trade through the Red Sea. North Korea and Iran enthusiastically sell arms to support Russia, while Chinese components and funds also help to sustain Russia's war effort. China has chosen to use its very welcome economic growth, which has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, to also pursue the fastest military build-up of our time. Under Xi Jinping, China has crushed freedoms in Hong Kong, aggressively pursues territorial claims in the South China Sea, and sought to militarily intimidate Taiwan. In a signal that can hardly be read as well-intentioned, concurrent with this escalation of conflict, these four countries have pursued joint military exercises or defence collaboration, while Russia and China declared their no-limits friendship. Elsewhere around the world, civil wars continue to take a heavy toll on human life, civil wars that gain too little attention and effort to resolve in places like Myanmar, the Maghreb region of North Africa, Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria and the Congo. Those blue beret peacekeeping initiatives seem to be a long time ago now in their effectiveness. The sum of all that we face today is a multilateral system that is as challenged as at any point in its history, and a world more challenging than at any point in recent history. We indeed face real efforts and challenges as to how we seek to ensure as a world that we actually deliver upon the potential of multilateral engagement in a world where who the powers are is increasingly questioned, including debates about whether we do face an era of multipolarity ahead. The paramount objective of preventing war is transparently failing. Conflicts are being waged and supported actively or tacitly with an aim of securing a broader geopolitical advantage. The actions or ambitions of some, accompanied by the understandable and growing distrust of others, now fuels the rapid rate of global military build-up. To avoid a repeat of 85 years ago, deterrence must be more effective today than appeasement was then. We must deliver deterrence via example, via defence capabilities and via effective diplomacy. Of course, we are having this meeting today in the shadow of the US election from last week. In President Trump, the US does have an incoming president who is less predictable, who is proudly a disruptor, who is prone to making and pursuing less conventional policies and making bolder pronouncements. But we should not instantly catastrophise that. Indeed, I was part of a government where we worked with the first Trump administration to shape and influence it. We have, and other countries have, done so before, done so effectively. And good can come. Think of the Abraham Accords, for example, and indeed the enduring nature of the Abraham Accords that have been tested in ways that none of us would have envisaged over the last 13, 14 months. And yet they have stood, and a demonstration that disruption and unconventional approaches can sometimes achieve breakthroughs. And that is what we have to try as a world to ensure we engage in ways and pursue that those breakthroughs are in our national interests and in global interests. To deter future aggressive actions, of course, Ukraine is going to be an early test and debate. It is important that we demonstrate strength in the resolution of that conflict. Ukraine must be helped to secure a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. While strong support has prevented Ukraine from failing during its war, as so many initially predicted, excessive caution has potentially also prevented it from prevailing. The sliding doors moments in this war included debates about enforcing a no-fly zone, delivering longer-range missiles, providing air combat capabilities, or the limits imposed on Ukraine's use of the weapons provided to it. None of us have ever wished to see a broadening of this war, but nor is it acceptable to just let it drag out to the very last Ukrainian. To help deter Russia and other global disruptors from future acts of aggression, the future of Ukraine must be strong and be seen to be strong. Vladimir Putin cannot be provided with the scale of victory he desires, and to be able to deter future aggression, Ukraine must be set in the strongest possible position of that just and enduring peace. In addition to setting deterrence via the type of example that can be had if Ukraine is to have a more secure and more just future, we must also create deterrence via effective defence capabilities. Such capabilities go to investment, innovation and cooperation. Back in 2013, the then newly elected Liberal-led government in Australia began delivering upon a very prescient election commitment to restore defence investment to 2% of GDP after the previous government had allowed it to fall to the lowest level since World War II. Think about that. That was 2013, before Donald Trump was elected and made achieving such benchmarks a key part of the US test that is applied. It was, of course, before we saw the outbreak of the types of conflicts and tension that we're so openly discussing today. But Australia took the initiative and the move at the time and followed through to increase and restore those defence investments. And that investment made subsequent capability decisions possible, including being a sufficiently credible partner to convince the United States to share their nuclear-powered submarine technology with another nation for only the second time in history. Again, in the wash-up of last week, there is much discussion at present about the future of AUKUS. I am confident in the future of AUKUS. AUKUS is mutually beneficial to Australia, to the United States and the United Kingdom. It is clearly in the US, in the interests of the US, for Australia to increase our own military capabilities and our own defence industrial capabilities. And AUKUS sees us paying our way to do just that through the shared technology. The birth of AUKUS in 2022 was built upon the trust established through 63 years of effective US-UK cooperation. It's a recognition that we all need to invest in creating effective deterrence, and that investment needs to boost both that defence capability and the defence industrial capability. AUKUS, alongside other immediate and longer-term defence capability requirements, demands us to go beyond that 2% budget investment. It also demands us to think big about cooperation. Removing the trade restrictions through the International Traffic in Arms Regulations reforms was an early win for why AUKUS matters. And it's a win for which I give Kevin Rudd some of the credit. Industry and governments should be seeking to build upon this breakthrough in the exchange of equipment, with subsequent breakthroughs in the exchange of people. AUKUS partners also need more transferable security clearances and specialist visas so that our human capital is as well placed as possible to deliver our much needed security capabilities. Within Pillar 2 of AUKUS and beyond, we must ensure that amongst democratic nations we're at the cutting edge of defence capability and strategy. Other nations are knocking on the door of AUKUS, while the Indo-Pacific 4 nations of Japan, South Korea, New Zealand and Australia also seek to ensure that we have greater access to the various capability interests that NATO could share with us. We should neither expect nor seek for NATO to have any type of hard military presence in the Indo-Pacific. But we should be looking to embed the best of strategic cooperation, interoperability and knowledge sharing across all of our nations. Liberal democratic market economies come together through the OECD to advance our economic cooperation, and we can do similarly through the sharing of knowledge through those other security partnerships. It can be especially beneficial in the new borderless defence domains of cyber and space, where neither attack nor defence are necessarily matters of territorial borders. Critically, though, it shouldn't be limited to those traditional partners. The opportunity in those areas, such as cyber and space, for deeper, richer partnerships of deterrence capabilities with partners like India is huge, given their technological prowess and investment. And it does warrant our investment in the time and resources to build out those partnerships too. A key point of creating deterrence via example and via defence capability is ultimately to then give room for diplomacy to do its job. It's called deterrence for a reason, to deter conflict. And we need the effective tools of diplomacy to then make that success. While talks in and of themselves can rarely produce peace when the conditions for conflict are already present, where those talks are instead from positions of shared strength or shared potential loss, then leaders have the incentive to avert conflict. We should be building out our pillars of diplomatic deterrence through overlapping networks of minilateralism. AUKUS and the Quad are two examples of such Australian engagement. Indeed, more regionally, pursuing relationships with our key partners, other G20 nations immediately in our region, such as Indonesia and India, are crucial. As I said before, it cannot just be amongst NATO or OECD nations. Australia's existing strength as ASEAN's longest dialogue partner, as indeed the largest, closest partner for the Pacific Island Forum nations, are crucial, and we must look further to strengthen those diplomatic partnerships with all who share our interest in respect for sovereignty and stability. The so-called Global South cannot be left to be disproportionately influenced or led by those who drive divisions based on their own pursuit of power or on an exploitation of perceived injustices, or who use financial means to distort or coerce current decision-making. Our position is one of wanting to see the agency and sovereignty of each nation, big and small, receive the respect it deserves so long as they respect each other. This should be the guiding principle that binds us. All nations should be brought to stand against what is happening to Ukraine or to the Philippines, lest the same ever occur to them. Our diplomatic efforts, accompanied by the deterrence framework I've outlined, must aim to breathe life back into the primary founding objective of the UN to avert global war. Aggressor states or oppressor states cannot be tolerated, and unlike 85 years ago, they should not be appeased. We must deter them from such aggression towards or oppression of their neighbours or any other neighbours. As King George VI said 85 years ago at the outbreak of that horrid Second World War, the primitive doctrine of might must be avoided, instead the pursuit of all hopes of peace and of the security of justice and liberty of all nations. Those generations prevailed. Our work, our effort and our responsibility is to ensure that so too does ours. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely.
Good. Senator Birmingham will take a few questions. I think you have to leave at 10, don't you? So we've got, so we've got 10 minutes. Now we have microphones at each end. So if you'd like to come to the microphone, we will choose whoever comes first. Maybe there won't be anybody. Do we have no questions? No, Melissa. Good on you, Melissa. Our former Executive Director, Melissa Conley-Tyler. If each person could say their name and any relevant organisation. Thank you.
Melissa Conley-Tyler from the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. So, Shadow Minister, you talked about the need to prevent the Global South being led in directions that I think are against Australia's interests. I'm interested in your view of Australia's development program and the way that it engages with the developing countries in our region and more broadly.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And our development program is clearly one of the most important tools that we have. And it is one where standing on the strength and credibility of that development program over many, many years is crucial. And I acknowledge there are people in this room who've worked on that development program over a long period of time and built up that credibility. And the credibility that we bring is one of seeking to invest and support the capability building within country and the priorities of those countries, and to do so in ways that respect their sovereignty and structure the program in ways that deliver for those nations. And it is crucial that we emphasise at all opportunities the very ethical and focused way in which our development program is delivered, and that we seek to partner with equally ethical nations to build out the sense of support that recipient countries have in terms of that program. It is challenged now, as we see. Welcome additional funding go into development from other countries, but it's also challenged by the type of elite capture models that run concurrent with that funding, and by the fact that others are not always as ethical and not always as focused in providing funding for the programs and projects that are for the benefit of the people of recipient nations, but instead perhaps serve the political interests of those who have been targeted as part of that elite capture regime and program. So that is one of the real challenges we face. We're not alone in the provision of development and assistance anymore. It is a contested space, and some of those contesting that space don't play by the same rules that we do. And so we need to put even more effort into ensuring projection of the standards we apply, and also capacity building across foreign governments to ensure that identification of corruption, identification of other problems within how aid monies are transferred or handled is given greater frequency and attention in those nations. Up the other end.
Hello, Senator. My name is Eleanor Shiori Hughes. I'm an American delegate with the AIIA and the Japan Foundation's Indo-Pacific Cooperation Network. I live in Washington, D.C. at a think tank that works on national security and defense issues. First of all, I really want to commend you and thank you for saying about the state of our elections and how we should not so easily catastrophize, because I think, at least in Washington, D.C., it's a very difficult thing to say, and I really appreciate that you said that with real sincerity, is how I think of it. My question, you laid out a lot, you talked a lot about the AUKUS and the Quad, about our alliance, and Australia's role in the world. When we as Americans vote on the ballot, I don't think foreign policy is something we think about in terms of what is our number one issue. My question is, what can Australia do to make it so that perhaps Americans have a better understanding of why AUKUS is a value add for our defense, why we should be more involved in the Quad, why we should have a greater presence across the spectrum, economic, whatever, in the Indo-Pacific and broad. I think that Australia could play a role in that. I think Americans, there is no singular understanding about what we do in the world. I think we do think about what are kitchen table issues like economics or immigration. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here and for your acknowledgement there. I think I gave Kevin a positive shout out in the speech, and I think Ambassador Rudd equally was right way back at the Republican National Convention when he got asked about engagement with his European counterparts in Washington, and he said that he'd been telling some of them to chill out about the prospect of President Trump. Now, it's not flippant. Obviously, we have to take all of the issues seriously, but we cannot talk the world into problems that will then become self-fulfilling and even greater problems. We've got to get on positively in pursuit of engagement and solutions where possible. Look, all politics is local, and all politics comes back to the hip pocket in democracies. So whether it's the US or Australia, foreign policy will usually only play a role in elections if something's going horribly wrong. That's, of course, why it's important that where and how we engage in advancing understanding and knowledge is really important. And for example, in AUKUS, the strong bipartisanship across both the House and the Senate is what gives us confidence that there is a depth of understanding. There aren't many things in Washington that enjoy the type of bipartisan support that AUKUS has had through the last couple of Congresses, and the fact that it does have that bipartisan support should give us real confidence that the messages are cutting through. I also have confidence that even though people may not prioritise as voters foreign policy in their thinking, instinctively they generally get it. If you look at things such as the Lowy Institute's annual research into the attitudes of Australians and see how they have shifted over time, you can see when people are quizzed about perceptions of China as an economic partner versus security risk, or when they are quizzed about views on different world leaders, instinctively they move, and they move with the type of discussions and school of thought that will often be had in rooms like this. So I think it does actually cut through at an understanding that sometimes we don't always appreciate. It doesn't mean that it drives voter intent necessarily, and we've got to be realistic about that, but it is why good foreign policy experts like many in this room and those with an interest in the space just have to work twice as hard at ensuring the legislators and leaders of the day are focused on the issues.
One last question. Our former AIIA Queensland President, Jeremy Webb.
Thank you. Given the new Trump administration is demonstrably less committed to the multilateralism and is demonstrably less committed to climate change, the question is how we deal with those issues in a new presidency. Is there not a scope for us to put a lot more resources in working with the EU and like-minded European countries to try and bring the Americans around to a more, particularly on climate change, where we can work with them? They are the leaders in pushing multilateral efforts in climate change. And is there not, I mean, we talk a lot about mixing with our Asian neighbours, but I do feel perhaps there's a lot more scope for the EU to us to work with the EU on this.
Thank you, and I am positive about the pursuit of greater cooperation with the EU. I think the security challenges the EU have faced have indeed brought us closer together in cooperation in those types of domains. Perhaps if there is a way to reignite discussions around the Australia-EU Free Trade Agreement, one of the hooks we might be able to do that is actually as a symbol of continued commitment to trade and openness, even against the type of tariff approaches that are going to be taken in relation to the Trump administration. Perhaps there's a hook there that we could use with the EU to move them. On climate change, again, I think cooperation with the EU is very important, but equally how we project the messaging and the ambition back into the Trump administration, I think, will also be very important. I have no doubt that President Trump and the majority of his administration will want the US to be technological leaders in lower emissions technologies. I mean, he's got Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, standing by his side. So, whilst he may not pursue the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act of President Biden, in the original concept, is he going to tear up all of those things that are successfully attracting investment and industries in new technologies and new areas of low emissions technology into the US? I suspect that there'll be plenty of people pushing to say, you've got to keep those fundamentals. and that actually that desire for the US, who pride themselves on their innovation and leadership in technology, will still be wanting to pursue essentially the Bill Gates model of what he's argued is required for emissions reduction to be successful globally. And that is, of course, to drive new technologies to cost points that are actually practical for their adoption, not just in countries like ours, but in an Indonesia or a Vietnam or across countries who can less afford to pursue higher cost means of adaptation. So I absolutely concur we should be working with the Europeans and others, but we shouldn't look at the climate change discussion as one where we give up on the US. I think if we simply browbeat President Trump and his administration over threats to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, that will likely not get us very far at all. But if we look at what is American self-interest, aligned with concepts of American exceptionalism, but how that can also help the world in terms of driving forward those new technologies in lower emissions, then there is an opportunity for us to chart a pathway that can be good.